Man, these headlines lately, it's all like World War III this and World War III that. Biden's talking about sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. Ukraine's hitting back harder and harder. And then, bam, Russia shows off its hypersonic missiles like it's nothing.
It's pretty intense, yeah?
It's unnerving, to be honest. It makes you wonder, like, what's really going on here? This whole thing feels so messy.
It's definitely complex, there's no doubt about that. And that's exactly why we're going to do this deep dive. We really need to go deeper than just what we see on the news every day. We got to understand the history here and where these different viewpoints are coming from.
Right, exactly.
And to do that, we're going to be taking a look at some different YouTube transcripts. Each one kind of offers a different perspective on the whole conflict,
But
right?
looking through different lenses.
Exactly. And hopefully by looking through these different lenses, we'll be able to answer the big question, like who are the key players? What really happened? When did all this start? Where are the main pressure points? And most importantly, the why. Why is this happening?
Absolutely. And, one thing that becomes super clear when you start digging into these sources is that there isn't like a simple, easy answer.
There's never an easy answer with these things.
It's not black and white at all. Like, you've got one side saying that this is all Putin's fault, and then you've got the other side saying, hold on, this is about NATO expansion and Ukraine's own actions, that they played a big role in this too. So look, we're not here to point fingers. Our goal is to really get into these arguments, understand them. Then we can trace the timeline, the history, and hopefully start to get a clearer picture, a more nuanced understanding of how we got to this point.
Exactly. And to do that, we're going to have to rewind the clock quite a bit.
Yeah, we're talking way back.
We're going to be looking at how Russia's territory has grown and changed since like the 1600s. And then we'll really focus on the time when Ukraine was under Russian or Soviet control, which is a crazy long time, like around 337 years.
Wow.
From 1667 all the way to 1991. That's like, think about it. That's about 91% of modern Ukraine's history.
That's huge. Yeah. That's most of their history. But then we can't forget what happened right after that period ended. Right?
Oh.
December 1st, 1991. That's a key date. Over 90% of Ukrainians, they voted for independence. It was a nationwide referendum, a really clear message.
That's a key moment.
The people had spoken. And that's a piece of the puzzle we can't ignore if we're trying to make sense of what's happening now.
So where should we start?
Well, I think we have to start with the fall of the Soviet Union and the whole debate about NATO expansion.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating to consider the mood back then in
Yeah.
the late Cold War. You had Reagan, and he was pushing this idea of, democracy and freedom, especially with the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. He started it back in the early 80s. They were all about promoting free speech, free markets, civil society, the rule of law. It was a whole new way of thinking compared to what the Soviets were used to.
A real challenge to the existing order.
And then on the other side, you had Gorbachev. And, surprisingly, he was actually open to some of these ideas.
Which I think really set the stage for a major shift in 1990. That's when Gorbachev agreed to let Germany reunite.
Yeah, a unified Germany. And not just that, he agreed that a unified Germany could stay in NATO.
But this agreement came with a condition, right?
Yeah.
It was a pretty big condition.
Yeah.
NATO wasn't supposed to expand east past Germany.
Right, that's a key point. It wasn't a formal treaty or anything, but there were these verbal assurances given to Gorbachev back in February 1990. Some of the biggest names in the West were there. You had Jim Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State, Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, even Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister.
A lot of political weight behind those promises.
Absolutely, a gentleman's agreement. And Baker even famously said, and I quote, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward beyond Germany.
So it sounds like a pretty clear commitment.
Yeah, at the time it did.
But then you look at a map today, and wow, NATO is way bigger. It's expanded a lot to the east. It's grown so much.
It's expanded quite a bit.
And I think for anyone listening, it's really important to try to see this from Russia's point of view. Think about it. They were given these promises, these assurances, and then, well, things turned out very differently, right? You can see how that could lead to some serious trust issues.
Yeah, you can imagine feeling betrayed, like the rug was pulled out from under you.
It makes you question, can you really rely on those agreements? So we see this early point of friction, these broken promises, as maybe planting the seeds for a lot of the mistrust and tension that we see playing out today.
Absolutely. A seed of discontent was sown right there.
Definitely. Okay, so let's keep moving along this timeline. What happens next?
So just a year later, in August of 91, George H.W. Bush, he gives his famous Chicken Kyiv speech.
Ah, yes, the Chicken Kyiv speech.
And in this speech, he basically warns Ukraine against what he calls suicidal nationalism. He's saying, look, be careful with this whole nationalism thing. He even pointed to certain groups within Ukraine that were using some pretty controversial symbols, like the OUN battalion with their Wolf's Angel insignia.
And that symbol had some pretty, let's say, questionable connections to certain extremist groups. It was definitely a red flag back then.
Yeah, it raised some eyebrows for sure.
And the timing here is really something, right? This speech was just a few months before that huge vote for Ukrainian independence in December. It's almost like Bush was saying, hey, are you sure about this? Think carefully about where you're headed. It suggests that even back then, the U.S. saw the dangers of unchecked nationalism in Ukraine. It's a theme that keeps popping up, you know?
It's a recurring theme for sure. A lot of people were wary of it.
Okay, so then, just a few months later, we're now in December of '91, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved.
The Soviet Union is no more.
And what happens? Boris Yeltsin, he sends this letter to NATO.
He says, hey, what if Russia joined NATO?
A bold move. He basically says, look, we're trying to build closer ties with the West. We want to be a democratic nation. Maybe joining NATO is part of that.
A really significant gesture, right? So you'd think NATO would be like, yeah, let's talk. But that's not what happened.
Right.
Nope. Pretty much crickets from NATO.
I can't believe that. Why not?
Well, the sources we looked at, they suggest a couple of reasons. Like, you got to remember, NATO, it was created to counter the Soviet Union. So if Russia, the biggest piece of the former Soviet Union, joins NATO, what's NATO's purpose then?
Right. That does make things complicated.
Yeah. And then you also have the whole military-industrial complex thing.
Oh, yeah, that idea that some groups benefit from conflict.
Exactly. It basically suggests that there are powerful interests, both in the military and in the industries that supply them that kind of like it when there's tension and conflict because it means more money and power for them.
Which is, yeah, that's a pretty cynical way to look at things. But
It's real politics for sure.
It makes you think.
Absolutely. And then a few years down the line, we get to 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum. This is where Ukraine says, okay, we'll give up our nuclear weapons.
They had a lot of them, right?
Yeah, they inherited this huge arsenal from the Soviet Union. It was the third largest in the world, something like 1,700 warheads. And they agreed to get rid of all of them in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the UK, and the US.
They were basically trading nukes for promises.
That's a good way to put it.
It's pretty risky, giving up your biggest deterrent like that.
Huge risk, but they did it. And it's really important to remember that Ukraine was willing to take this risk. They wanted those security guarantees.
And to be fair, Ukraine adopted its first constitution as an independent nation back in '96, and they had help from the U.S. with that. So at that point, things seemed to be moving in a, let's say, a more positive direction, right?
Yeah, there was this sense of, maybe we can build a new future together.
Right. But then, around the year 2000, the whole NATO thing pops up again. Putin, in an interview with the BBC, he says, maybe Russia would join NATO if we were treated as equals.
Testing the waters, perhaps? It's hard to say what his real intention was there.
Right. But in the mid-90s, Ukraine gives up its nukes for security. A few years later, Putin's floating the idea of Russia joining NATO. What a roller coaster.
Yeah, the 90s and early 2000s were a wild time in geopolitics. A lot of shifting sands.
But then there's this story that really makes you think. It's from Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin. Putin tells this anecdote where he's talking to Bill Clinton.
This must have been during one of Clinton's visits to Russia.
Yeah, and Putin straight up asks Clinton about Russia joining NATO. And Clinton's response is, oh, that's an interesting idea. Let me talk to my team. But when the answer came back, it was a hard no.
Imagine that, Russia as part of NATO, it would have completely reshaped the global security landscape.
Yeah, talk about a missed opportunity. It makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if they had said yes? Would we be in the same situation today? Who knows?
History is full of these what-ifs. It's fascinating, but also frustrating.
For sure. Okay, so let's keep going. What comes next in this whole saga?
So I think it's important to talk about this period where, right after 9/11, you see this initial cooperation between Russia and the U.S.
Right after the 9/11 attacks.
Putin was one of the first world leaders to reach out, offer his condolences, and say, hey, we're with you in this fight against terrorism.
Yeah, he seemed genuinely horrified by what happened.
He really did. And, Russia has its own long history of dealing with terrorism, so he understood the pain and the fear. He even offered some pretty significant logistical help for the U.S. in Afghanistan. Like, he opened up Russian airspace, he let the U.S. use bases in Central Asia, and he shared intelligence about terrorist networks.
It's easy to forget that time, that period of collaboration.
Yeah, there was this brief moment where it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Russia and the West could work together.
But it didn't last very long, did it?
No, it didn't. Things started to sour pretty quickly.
So what happened? Why the change?
Well, for one thing, Putin was really against the Iraq War. He saw it as, this destabilizing force in the region. He felt like it wasn't really about counterterrorism, it was about something else. And then you had the whole color revolutions thing.
Those uprisings in some of the former Soviet republics.
Exactly. You had the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, and then the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And the U.S. was seen as, being very involved in supporting these revolutions, these movements for democracy.
Which, from Putin's perspective, looked like the U.S. was trying to undermine him, right?
Absolutely. He felt like the U.S. was trying to encroach on Russia's sphere of influence, these countries that Russia considered strategically important. He felt threatened, like they were trying to box him in.
And I think it's important to remember, this whole time, NATO is still expanding, moving closer and closer to Russia's borders.
That's a key factor, for sure. It was like this constant pressure, a constant reminder of the broken promises from early 90s. So it's a complex picture. On the one hand, you have this push for democracy and human rights, but on the other hand, you have these geopolitical power struggles, this fear of encirclement.
And it all comes to a head with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, 2005. That was a huge turning point, right?
Yeah. It was a watershed moment, no doubt. The Orange Revolution, it was all about this disputed presidential election. You had Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as pro-Russia, and then you had Viktor Yushchenko, who was more pro-West.
And there were accusations of election fraud, protests in the streets, the whole thing.
It was intense. There were massive protests in Kiev, the capital, and it went on for weeks. Ultimately, the Supreme Court stepped in and they ordered a new election. And in that new election, Yushchenko won.
So a victory for the pro-West side.
Right. But what's really important here is the alleged involvement of groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and George Soros's Open Society Foundation in those protests.
They were accused of funding the protests, organizing them.
Yeah, right. The suggestion is that they were actively working to support the pro-Western candidate, Yushchenko. And, it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives on this. Some people argue that these groups were simply supporting democratic movements. But from Putin's point of view, it looked like a Western-backed coup.
It confirmed his suspicions, right? It fed into that narrative of the West trying to undermine him.
Absolutely. And, it's crucial to note that Yanukovych, the guy who lost, he was not in favor of Ukraine joining NATO.
Right. So from Putin's perspective, the West had interfered in Ukraine's election and helped to install a leader who was more likely to push for NATO membership.
Exactly. And that was a huge red line for him.
Okay, so the Orange Revolution happens, tensions are rising. What comes next?
So we fast forward a bit. Putin steps down as president in 2008. Constitutionally, he couldn't serve another term.
Right, term limits.
So Dmitry Medvedev, he becomes president, and Putin, he becomes prime minister. But then in 2011, 2012, you have these massive protests in Russia.
People were unhappy with Putin, even though he wasn't president at the time.
Right. These protests, they were about corruption, about lack of democracy. Some people called them the Snow Revolution because they happened during the winter. And there were even accusations that these protests were being funded by Western NGOs.
So more fuel for Putin's fire.
Exactly. And then in 2012, Putin returns to the presidency. And his response to these protests is pretty telling. He cracks down on dissent, he imposes stricter controls on NGOs, and he really starts to ramp up the anti-Western rhetoric. He's blaming these protests on foreign interference, saying that the West is trying to destabilize Russia.
And that's when he passes that law requiring NGOs that receive funding from abroad to register as foreign agents, right?
Exactly. That law was a big deal. It was basically saying, look, if you're getting money from outside Russia, you're a potential threat.
It's interesting, this idea of foreign influence in domestic politics. It's not just a Russian issue. We see similar debates happening in other countries, too.
Oh, absolutely. It's a global phenomenon.
It makes you think about where the line is, between legitimate foreign engagement and, meddling in other countries' affairs.
Where does influence become interference? It's a tough question.
Yeah. But for Putin, it seems like he had his answer and he wasn't going to tolerate it.
And I think it's really important to bring up this confidential cable that was written back in February 2008. It was written by William J. Burns.
Who, at the time, was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and he's a CIA director now.
A pretty important guy.
Yeah, not just anyone. And this cable, it had a pretty striking title. It was called Net Means Yet, Russia's NATO Enlargement Red Lines.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty direct. And in the cable, Burns is laying it out. He's saying, look, Russia is really, really against NATO expanding eastward, especially into Ukraine and Georgia. They see it as a direct threat, a military threat. They're saying this is crossing a line. And, get this, Burns even warns that if Ukraine tries to join NATO, it could lead to violence, maybe even civil war. And he says Russia might have to step in.
So this was a clear warning from the U.S. ambassador himself 16 years before the current war started. It's chilling, how it foreshadows everything that's happened. It really makes you think, what if those warnings had been taken more seriously?
It's a big what if.
Yeah. So, okay, we've got these warnings from Burns. What happens in the years leading up to the actual invasion?
Well, you see this gradual escalation of tensions. NATO starts to increase its military presence in Eastern Europe. They start holding these big military exercises near Russia's borders. And Russia, they're not just sitting there, they're holding their own exercises too.
It's like both sides are flexing their muscles, trying to intimidate each other.
Exactly. And then you've got cyber attacks happening, accusations flying back and forth. And one of the videos we watched, the one from Valuetainment, it pointed out that in 2019, Ukraine actually put it in their constitution that they want to join NATO. Like, it became an official goal.
So Ukraine was making it clear, this is what we want. We want to be part of NATO.
Yep. And then in late 2021, things really start to heat up. Russia starts amassing a huge number of troops along the Ukrainian border, and they issue these demands to the West. They're basically saying, look, we need guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. And they want NATO to pull back its military presence in Eastern Europe.
So a pretty firm line in the sand.
Yeah, they're saying this is non-negotiable. We're serious. But NATO, they reject those demands. They say, no, Ukraine has the right to choose its own alliances. We're not backing down.
And that sets the stage for the full-scale invasion in February 2022.
And sadly, here we are.
And the situation on the ground right now, it's pretty bleak.
It's grim, yeah. We were looking at this report from Lovely Ion, and it paints a pretty devastating picture. There are these constant attacks going back and forth. Russia is launching missiles and drones and glide bombs. They're hitting all these major Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, Sumy, you name it.
And they're making some territorial gains in the east,
Yeah.
even though they're meeting a lot of resistance from the Ukrainians.
Right. The Ukrainians are really putting up a fight. They're using drones really effectively, but it's a brutal war of attrition.
And it's not just Russia attacking. Ukraine is hitting back, too. They've taken out helicopters in Belgorod Oblast, which is inside Russia. They blew up a gas pumping station in the Kursk region.
Yeah, that one was controversial. Russia said it was a violation of this moratorium on attacks on energy infrastructure. But, it shows that Ukraine is willing to take the fight to Russia, to hit them on their own territory.
They're not holding back.
Nope. And all this is happening while the U.S. is trying to get both sides to the negotiating table. They've been holding these talks in Saudi Arabia. Even President Trump has come out and said that he wants a quick resolution to the conflict.
But it doesn't sound like things are going very well, are they?
Not really. There's been talk of a temporary ceasefire, but nothing concrete has come out of it. Russia wants Ukraine to stop attacking their energy infrastructure, and they want the Black Sea grain deal to be restarted.
A deal that lets Ukraine ship grain out of its Black Sea ports.
Exactly. But Ukraine is wary of any kind of truce. They're worried that Russia will just use it to regroup and then launch another offensive.
They don't trust them.
Yeah, and you can't really blame them, can you, after everything that's happened?
It's a mess.
It really is. And there was this expert, Jane Kinnenmont. She works for the European Leadership Network, and she was quoted in that One Aeon report. And she basically said that she's not very optimistic about these peace talks.
Really? Why not?
Well, for one thing, she said that you've got two superpowers on different sides, meaning Russia and the U.S., and that makes things really difficult, to get anything done. She also said that she's worried that the U.S. might be alienating Ukraine by getting too close to Russia in these talks. Like she said, the U.S. might end up burning its bridges with Ukraine if it keeps this up. And then she made this interesting point. She said that it's actually pretty common for warring sides to actually increase their fighting right before peace talks.
So like a power move to try to get an advantage.
Exactly. They're trying to improve their bargaining position to show that they're still strong, that they're not backing down.
So it's almost like the worse the fighting gets, the closer we might be to some kind of peace deal. That's a weird thought.
It's counterintuitive, that's for sure. But unfortunately, that's often how these things work.
Okay, so we've talked about the current situation, but now I think we need to get into something that's pretty scary. A hypothetical scenario that one of our sources explored.
The potential for a nuclear attack.
Exactly. The infographic show video, they really went there. They talked about what might happen if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon in eastern Ukraine in 2025.
A limited nuclear strike.
Yeah. And they didn't sugarcoat it. It was a pretty terrifying picture. So in this hypothetical scenario, Russia launches a Kinzhal hypersonic missile,
A Kinzhal, wow, that's one of their most advanced weapons systems.
and it's
Wow.
armed with a tactical nuclear warhead. And they detonate this thing, not on the ground, but in the air over eastern Ukraine.
An airburst detonation. That would maximize the blast radius.
And the effects, they describe them as catastrophic. Like you'd have this huge fireball, blinding light, the thermal radiation would be intense, and then the shockwave would just level everything in its path. There'd be debris flying everywhere.
It's hard to even imagine the devastation.
Yeah. And they say that, because of the trenches and bunkers that they have in eastern Ukraine, the actual casualties might not be as high as you'd think. But the point is, it's a statement, right?
It's a show of force, a way of saying, look, we're willing to use nukes, don't mess with us.
Yeah. And this scenario, it comes after a period of super high tension back in 2022, after Ukraine launched that big counteroffensive.
Yeah, when they pushed back the Russians in some areas.
And the video even suggests that President Biden, he actually intervened to stop Ukraine from completely defeating Russia in Kherson.
Interesting. They're saying he was worried that if Russia suffered a huge defeat, Putin might actually resort to using nukes out of desperation.
So the U.S. was trying to prevent a situation where Putin felt cornered, like he had no other option.
Trying to manage the escalation.
Yeah. And it's also reported that China and India, they both privately warned Putin against using nukes back then.
Putting pressure on him from all sides.
Yeah. And the U.S., they apparently issued their own warning to Russia, too.
And what did they say? What was the message?
They basically said that if Russia used a nuclear weapon, the U.S. would immediately retaliate.
Wow. So like a tit-for-tat response.
Yeah, they said they'd take out whatever unit was responsible for the nuclear strike. And they also said that if Russia kept using nukes, the U.S. would escalate things big time, basically unleash the full force of the U.S. military on Russian forces in Ukraine.
A pretty stark warning.
Yeah. And, at the time, it seemed like those warnings worked, right? Russia didn't use nukes.
They pulled back from the brink.
But here's the really scary part. The infographics show video. They fast forward to 2025, and the situation is completely different.
How so?
The U.S. has completely abandoned Ukraine. They've cut off all aid. They've stopped their cyber operations against Russia. They're even siding with Russia at the UN.
Wow. A complete 180.
Yeah, it's like they've totally washed their hands of the whole thing.
And what about Ukraine?
They're basically on their own. The U.S. is even actively undermining their efforts to negotiate peace with Russia.
That's wild. So what happens in this scenario when Russia uses that tactical nuke?
That's the big question, right? Is does the U.S. stick to its earlier warning and retaliate? Or, since they've abandoned Ukraine, do they just sit back and let it happen? It's a terrifying thought.
A chilling prospect for sure. And it raises some serious questions about, the future of nuclear deterrence. If a country like Russia can use a nuke and get away with it, what does that mean for other countries that might be thinking about developing nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it sets a dangerous precedent.
And the infographics show video makes another interesting point. They say that other countries, like Iran, for example, might look at what happened to Ukraine after they gave up their nukes and think, hey, maybe we should hold on to ours. Maybe it's not such a good idea to give them up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
If you can't trust security guarantees, what other option do you have but to protect yourself?
Exactly. It's a really bleak outlook, but unfortunately, it's a realistic one.
Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the end of the Cold War all the way to this, potential nuclear nightmare scenario.
It's a long and winding road.
But there's one big question that we haven't really answered yet, and that's the question of why. What are the real motives behind all of this? Why is this happening?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. In the Valuetainment video, they touched on this.
They did. And they offered a few potential explanations, a few different motives.
Right. So for Russia, the video says that it could be about history. Like Russia has these long-standing claims to Ukraine. They see Ukraine as part of their historical and cultural sphere.
It's that whole idea of Kievan Rus', the medieval East Slavic state that both Russia and Ukraine see as their common ancestor.
Right. And then there's the security angle.
Right.
Russia feels threatened by NATO expanding right up to its borders. They see it as an existential threat.
It's like having a hostile alliance right on your doorstep.
Exactly. And then for NATO and the U.S., the video says that the initial motivation might have been to contain Soviet influence and later Russian influence.
That was the whole point of NATO in the first place, to prevent the spread of communism.
Right. And then there's this idea of the military-industrial complex that we talked about earlier.
The idea that some powerful groups actually benefit from conflict.
Yeah, it's a cynical view, but it's hard to ignore.
Especially when you see how much money is being made from this war, from selling weapons and providing military aid.
And then the valuetainment video, they go even further, right? They talk about some pretty controversial theories.
Yeah, they get into some pretty speculative territory. Like, they talk about the possibility that major banks are actually profiting from wars like this.
How's that?
Well, the theory is that these banks, they lend money to countries that are rebuilding after a war, and then they take the country's natural resources as collateral. So the more wars there are, the more money they can make.
It's a disturbing thought. Like, are wars being deliberately engineered for profit?
It's a very controversial theory, and there's not a lot of evidence to support it. But it's out there, and it's something to think about.
And then there's that other really sensitive point that the video brings up about Russia's vast natural resources.
The fact that they have the largest reserves of natural resources in the world.
Yeah. And the video suggests that, for some people, removing Putin from power might be seen as a way to get access to those resources.
A way to unlock that potential wealth.
It's a very cynical view. And, I want to be clear, we're not endorsing any of these theories. We're just reporting on what the source material says.
Right. It's important for listeners to understand that these are just theories, different perspectives.
Yeah. But I think the valuetainment video makes a really important point. They say that we need to study history to really understand the different motives at play. And they say that ultimately history will judge who was right and who was wrong.
Yeah. And it may take a while for that judgment to come, but it will come.
So, wow, that's a lot to digest.
It's a lot, yeah.
We've covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, the broken promises about NATO expansion, the warnings that were ignored, the growing mistrust, the Orange Revolution, Putin's return to power, the escalation of tensions, the current war, and even the terrifying possibility of a nuclear conflict.
It's been a whirlwind tour of history.
Yeah, and we've seen that.